In the past, it was a staple of kidnappings for the hostage to hold up a newspaper to prove that they were still alive. The problem with me is that I started reading the newspapers I was holding up, although I'm still, as you can judge by our social media overlords, in captivity. Nevertheless, I'll try my best to get what news I can out to you given the constraints. First up, stories on the domestic news front that I'm tracking. First up, there's an article entitled, UPS is cutting 12,000 jobs just months after reaching union deal. In it we read, UPS will cut 12,000 jobs and released a revenue outlook for this year that sent its shares down sharply at the opening bell. The company also hinted that its Coyote truckload brokerage business may be put up for sale. The Teamsters in September voted to approve a tentative contract agreement with UPS, putting a final seal on contentious labor negotiations that threaten to disrupt package deliveries for millions of businesses and households nationwide. On a conference call Tuesday morning, CEO Carol Tome said that by reducing the company's headcount, UPS will realize $1 billion in cost savings. UPS also said Tuesday that its board approved an increase of 1 cent in its quarterly dividend to shareholders of record February 20th. This story is more than about UPS or package delivery services. H.G. Wells, who wrote a book called Anticipations in 1899, predicting the year 2000, right? He was looking 100 years ahead, and he was worried about the human race surviving. And he said one of the biggest innovations that had taken place was the creation of the joint stock company. And he said that they would, kind of be sociopathic. There would be no guiding intelligence, and this was very dangerous for society. In the feudal age, for instance, the king, or the aristocrats or whoever would not abuse the peasants or the land beyond a certain point because it would be against his interests, right? So he had a guiding intelligence. He wouldn't just blow things up. However, with stock, you have diffuse ownership of a company, and you have, kind of diffuse responsibility. And this leads to sociopathic behavior, in which case, they might crater an entire region so that their stock goes up, as in this case, a penny. So 12,000 people get laid off, or fired, actually, downsized, so that people in the C-suite can say, hey, look, we saved $1 billion, and the stock goes up a penny. This is, kind of one of the dangers of the system that we're in right now. We were told that we're not going to be a productive economy anymore. We're going to be a service-based economy, and it's wonderful. Let's get rid of our factories. Let's get rid of everything. Let's go from a capitalist system to a mercantilist system where we don't go to mom and pop stores, that get things from factories made like a couple miles away, but we're going to have this global supply chain. And then, you're going to order things not from a store, but from the internet, especially after the last global crisis. And, we now use a web-based straight-to-your-door method of commerce that relies on postal companies like UPS. And we were, asked to sacrifice our domestic industrial base for this global supply chain model, which brings us to international news. Speaking of global supply chains, I was reading a book entitled Dream Worlds of Race. It's about the English plan to reabsorb America into the British Empire. One of the big proponents of uniting the two countries was billionaire Andrew Carnegie. He spent the last 30 years of his life advocating for a reunion between the two English-speaking nations. Two factors conduced to bringing this about. One was the telegraph, the first transatlantic communication system stitched the two countries together via communications. Information technology erased the influence of geography in keeping distant lands separate. In the book we read, commentators and scientists alike drew on the language of the nervous system to describe the nature and functioning of the telegraph, just as telegraphic imagery fed into scientific work on the human body. The nervous system metaphor was fused with older organic images of the political community to provide a new account of the body politic. It was animated, controlled, and disciplined by the circulation of electrical pulses carrying information. The electrical dream pervaded Anglo-American discourse. Forming part of a cohesive information order, the English race was envisaged as a global extended community, bound and ordered by electricity. Obsessed with the political implications of communications technology, Carnegie asserted that immense expanses of water no longer constitute barriers between nations. He later added that oceans, which once separated countries, now drew them together. Of course, he was referring to trade. And that was the second big binding agent that they alluded to, the telegraph and maritime trade. The latter they wanted to use to create trade agreements as a method of stitching the two countries together, which they later did with NATO. At any rate, the point is maritime trade is of inestimable importance to imperial power, as this article by Zero Hedge points out. It says, historically, the biggest economies in the world have also been those that dominate international trade overseas. Visual capitalists Niccolò Conte and Bruno Venditti created the following graphic using data from the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the World Trade Organization to show how global export shares by value have changed over the last 150 years for some of the world's top powers. You can look at this chart and see how massive Great Britain used to be in terms of maritime trade. Then you can see how the US started to dominate. Recently, if you notice on the very bottom of the chart, how China went from nothing for most of modern history to a position of dominance. This is why there are growing tensions in the South China Sea. If China acquires Taiwan, it will gain access to the wider Pacific Ocean and develop what's called blue water maritime capabilities. This is an existential threat to global American money and power.
If China were to take Taiwan, it would be able to break into the Pacific Ocean. It'd be able to send its ships there unimpeded. That's one of the things that's keeping China from being a blue water navy, we call it.
This, plus China's establishment of strategic ports around the world, is seen as a growing threat to Anglo-American commercial and imperial dominance. Of course, the Atlanticist power structure has to frame it as China being evil and dictatorial, which is why you're going to get that narrative in the press going forward, as this analyst points out.
But there's basically a Western narrative, and what I would say for shorthand form an Asian narrative. And the Western narrative is very clear, very stark, very direct. Why is there a threat of war in South China Sea? It's because China has emerged as a great power, and with China's emergence as a great power, it is now threatening its Southeast Asian neighbors. It's reinforcing the islands in the South China Sea. It has a 9-dash line claiming all of South China Sea. And of course, you saw that when the Philippines took China to the tribunal, China rejected it, and and then Xi Jinping promised to demilitarize the South China Sea, and then he broke his promise. And all this you can find, by the way, in my book As China Won, all the details. So the Western narrative is very stark, very clear, and as someone who travels around the world, I can tell you that the Anglo-Saxon media makes it clear there's only one narrative, and that's the correct narrative. But then what I call the Asian narrative, again, at the risk of oversimplification, that the problem in South China Sea is really not between China and the Southeast Asian countries. Is that this region is basically becoming a pawn in a much bigger geopolitical struggle that has emerged between the United States and China. And the real threat to this region doesn't come from China's aggression or China's assertiveness. It comes from the fact that now, when the United States is looking for ways and means of embarrassing or bringing down China, it's very useful to use South China Sea as a weapon against China and use everything there and say, see, all this proves that China is aggressive, assertive, duplicitous, and so on and so forth. So I hope that's made it clear. These are the two narratives. But the next question is, which narrative is right? And I can tell you that in the Western world, there's a total conviction that the Western narrative is right, and there's no other narrative to consider. And what is interesting, I find, is that you cannot even get agreement on what are the facts between the two cases. So I'll give you a simple example. I've spoken to so many people in Europe and the United States. They are absolutely convinced that Xi Jinping was completely duplicitous in promising to demilitarize the South China Sea and then reneged on his promise and went ahead and militarized the South China Sea. I haven't met a single person in the West who doubts this to be the truth. But I discovered, ironically, from a former American ambassador to China, who probably will go down as one of the best ambassadors of the United States ever to China. And some people in Singapore also know him very well because he also was a U.S. ambassador to Singapore. His name is Stapleton Roy. He actually, as a child, grew up in China, speaks Chinese fluently, understands China very deeply. And when I was doing research for my book, Has China Won?, I had a one-on-one lunch with him in Washington, D.C. And he told me, Kishore, at the meeting between Xi Jinping and Obama, Obama raised the subject of South China Sea and said, why are you being so assertive? And Xi Jinping told Obama, okay, if you think this is the problem, why don't both of us agree? We both of us agree to demilitarize the South China Sea, and neither China nor US will set up military facilities in South China Sea. And Stapleton Roy said to me, Kishore, we should have seized that offer and said, good, because what we would have accomplished is we would have got China to demilitarize an area right next to China. This is a gift to the United States. And Stapleton Roy said to me, stupidly, we rebuffed that offer and we stepped up the naval patrols.
At any rate, the point is, the problem with UPS and the layoffs of package service companies may get worse if our global supply chain is threatened and the whole model, which we've been building out since the 1990s, gets disrupted by geopolitical power shifts. You may find this weird, but that's all right, because that leads into our News of the Weird segment. There's an article entitled, Anger Management Therapist Loses It, Murders Man While Witnesses Watch. A Florida therapist who specializes in anger management has been charged with murder in connection with the death of a man whose body was found in the therapist's car. Travis McBride, 46, was charged January 19th with first-degree murder, premeditated murder in the death of Clinton Dorsett, 51, according to WESH-TV in Daytona Beach. The killing was first reported on the morning of January 18th. There's been a murder that happened, a caller to 911 told a dispatcher, according to WESH. We got a couple of eyewitnesses, and I believe the person right now, he's looking at the road, cleaning up the blood off the ground. The website Law and Crime said a DeLand police affidavit quoted a woman identified as W1, who said McBride allegedly accused Dorsey, who was thought to be homeless, of doing something to harm dogs owned by the suspect. This unfortunately ironic incident ended up in bloodshed and death, which provides us with a natural segue to our obituary segment. Cheetah Rivera, Broadway's first great triple threat, dies at age 91. Cheetah Rivera, who appeared in more than 20 Broadway musicals over 6 decades, has died, according to her daughter, Lisa Mordaunt. The 3-time Tony Award-winning Broadway legend created incredible roles: Anita in West Side Story, Rose in Bye Bye Birdie, Velma Kelly in Chicago, and Aurora in Kiss of the Spider-Woman. She was 91. Rivera was everything Broadway was meant to be, says Lawrence Maslin, co-producer of the 2004 PBS series Broadway, the American Musical. She was spontaneous and compelling and talented as hell for decades and decades on Broadway. Once you saw her, you never forgot her. And with that, I would like to thank you for watching the show, or as I like to call it, that suspicious gap in my resume. See you next time. Consider subscribing to my new podcast, Classic Paranormal. It's a clearinghouse for lost real-life accounts of true ghost stories. It's found on Apple Podcasts. Go there now if you're interested in enigmatic tales, chilling true accounts, chronicles from cases of the past that time has forgotten, but that the modern person who likes relaxing by a campfire swapping ghost stories might appreciate. As I said, the new podcast I'm launching is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a link in the description below on this video.